Daniel chapter 11. Our subject, I should say Daniel's subject in this chapter in the book of Daniel is another warning and a picture of God's arch enemy in the world that's, I believe, probably living today and in the near future is going to begin his overt career in leading the world in its final rebellion or near to final rebellion against God. I believe that human history is moving to a preordained end. That's how I see life. I hope you see it that way too. The God who spoke the world into existence, the universe, by his great power. Behind the scenes is the, if you want to call him the ultimate chess player, who has been arranging his moves and causing his will to be worked out upon planet Earth for nearly 6,000 years of human history, and there is still 1,000 plus to come. And we are privileged to know from his word, the scriptures, many of the critical details about that process. It's encouraging for us to know what's going to happen, and it's also challenging for us to make sure that we align ourselves with God's purposes in the world today, that we learn from the lessons of history, that we learn from his instructions today, that we stand for truth, that we become true believers, steadfast in our convictions and in our determination to live for Jesus Christ today, so that we can take as many with us into God's kingdom as God privileges us to influence. I believe that someday the present invisible divine rule in this world will become visible when Satan's final divine opponent arises against God. We know him as the Antichrist. This chapter speaks of the Antichrist. It's a fascinating part of the Bible that reminds us that we are moving to a point where the Antichrist, whose career has long been known to God's people and has always been known to God himself, will actually be implemented. And the world stage as we are living in it today is presently being set up so that this person's career will be possible. All of these events that we're going to be reminded of from the scriptures this morning remind us of two things: the need for an awareness of God's plan on our part, and the need for us to trust God through our provincial elections. We need to trust God through the critical events of our world, to not become bitter and apathetic and callous and self-centered and diverted from the life for God. That's what we need to learn from this. God has his people, and boy, it's so easy for us to step off the path into the darkness and not to live with or function with his people. And so this chapter is simply another reminder. Look, at God knows what he's doing, and he wants us to know what he's doing. And he wants us, by implication, to align ourselves with him in what he is doing. By way of introduction this morning, I want to just say that this chapter is about the Greek world empire that existed about 300 years before Jesus Christ, and parts of it existed right up until the time of Christ. The things that were revealed to Daniel in this chapter covered about 300 or 400 years before Christ. Much of the stuff that is revealed as prophecies in this chapter, unlike many of the other prophecies of the Bible, there is no record of many of these things in the Bible as occurring. We don't have a historical record. We do, however, have history books, and this is a secular history book written by a non-Christian man whose writings are still known to us today, who lived through many of the events that Daniel predicted in the years prior to Christ. Actually, he lived just after them, and he was a historian recounting the intertestament period of the Greek Empire. The Bible stops basically with the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC, and it doesn't actually give us any historical accounts of the existence and the history of the Greek Empire and of the early Roman Empire. The New Testament picks up, 400 years later with the Roman Empire already in position and function. Nevertheless, even though the Bible doesn't record the historical fulfillment of the prophecies of this chapter, what we find are remarkable predictions that we see ending with a finger pointed to the Antichrist coming. What happened in the days of the Greek Empire was many of those events were parallel to almost identical events that still haven't yet happened, that this chapter in the Bible predicts will happen in the final human rebellion against Jesus Christ just before Christ comes back. And Jesus Christ himself, as we're going to see the next time we get together in Daniel, Jesus Christ is going to put an end to human rule at the end of the tribulation. He's going to stop the Antichrist's career. He himself is going to assume the throne visibly in the world and reign for 1,000 years. Phenomenal stuff. And throughout the history of the Bible, we have many, many types, analogies, parallels, and pictures of the future. Think with me for a few moments, just to get your mind in gear here, of very familiar events that you and I have grown up hearing about in church and in Sunday school or reading in the Bible. For example, the story of, in Genesis chapter 3, of a snake that began to talk to a woman named Eve. That in itself is a picture of Satan, who all through human history was going to use similar means. He himself was going to use human agents to accomplish his will of deception, deceit, lying, and so forth. It's still happening today. In the same chapter in the Bible talks about the serpent's judgment. God said, I will make you crawl on your belly. Right? He said that to the snake. But he was really speaking to Satan. And that judgment that is given in the opening chapters of the Bible pictures something that hasn't yet actually been implemented to its fullness, the ultimate judgment of the devil at the end of time, at the end of the present cosmos, in which we can read about that in the 20th chapter of the book of Revelation. It's predicted in the opening chapters of the Bible, and those events picture, the fact that God said, I will cause your head to be bruised, even though you will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman. That's a prophecy of the serpents and Satan's ultimate judgment. Later on in that chapter, after Adam and Eve sinned, God covered them with skins of an animal that he himself had slain for them. And that was a picture, an analogy of the ultimate sacrifice, of the ultimate Lamb of God for sinners, that they might be cleansed. And we're going to see Adam and Eve in heaven someday, because they were redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. And so these events are pictures of future events that we know many of them have taken place. In Genesis chapter 6, we have the story of Noah building this great boat, this ark. And that boat, if you read the details, is very symbolic. It's a picture of Jesus Christ, the ultimate place of safety, the one that will help us ride through the storm of God's judgment in the end. And if you're in the ark, you're safe. If you're not, you're doomed. Genesis chapter 11, you may remember the story of how all the nations of the world came together in rebellion against God's very explicit order at the opening chapters of the Bible to fill the earth, multiply, subdue it, and have dominion over it. And they said, no, let's stay together. And at Babel, the world, in rebellion against God, lifted its collective fist, united together in one world language, government, and religion to fight God. And God went, no, you don't. Which was a picture of what's going to happen at the end of time, when there's going to be a one world government, one world religion, one world rebellion against God. It's going to climax in the days of the Antichrist, and God is going to say, once and for all, no, you don't. And so Bible events, many of them are pictures of what God is going to do in the future. And not just pictured, not just events, but we have explicit prophetic pronouncements by God in such chapters as in Daniel chapter 11, telling us what is going to happen in detail. But even some of those events that were going to happen and the people involved in those prophesied events themselves are very clearly pictures of things that will follow them. It's fascinating how complex it gets. God says, this is going to happen over here. When you get over here, this person is a picture of something else that's going to happen over here. And that's the nature of the beast here in this chapter in the Bible. Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 record two visions. Nebuchadnezzar, a Babylonian king, had one vision of this image that was a picture of 4 great world kingdoms. Daniel later on had a dream himself of 4 different weird-looking creatures that pictured the same 4 Gentile kingdoms. These 2 visions in this book parallel or picture the world's major political systems that take us right up to the end of human history. Did you know that? Prior to the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, his visible rule, God is telling us in the book of Daniel information that is not found elsewhere prior in the Bible until the book of Daniel. It's a fascinating book. It's a critically important book for us to understand. God has a plan, and God is in control of politics in this world. Let us never forget it. Now we're focusing on chapter 11. Chapter 11 is actually an amplification, an extension of what God had already revealed a few years earlier to Daniel. It's recorded in chapter 8. In the year 602, 66 years before Daniel got the vision of chapter 11, God had told him that there was going to be a Greek world empire. 66 years before this. 17 years before the events in Daniel chapter 11, we read in chapter 7 again that God re-emphasized it in Daniel's own vision that there was going to be a Greek world empire that would follow the Persians and would precede the Romans. 15 years before this event, we read in chapter 8 that God had told Daniel in great detail what would happen, how the transition of power would go from the Persian Empire to the Greeks. The ram against the goat. All right? And the fighting that would go east-west there 5 centuries BC. And now in this chapter, it's as if God is reluctant to leave us with just a general picture. God wants to demonstrate just how detailed is his control over human events in history, so that we would learn the lesson once and for all that God is a God that knows when the sparrow falls, that knows when the skunks and the coons and the possums get run over, and the deer, they get run over on I-70. Like I was thinking about that yesterday. I was coming home, all these animals, and I was just thinking, God sees the sparrow fall. I wonder what the meaning is, for that possum that I just drove past, to have its gut splatter all over the road. Like, what's the purpose for that? And we must have an awesome God if he can see all of that, and there is a reason for all of these events. I wouldn't blame God for that, but there has to be a reason for it. I don't think anything happens by mere chance. I mean, God explains in this chapter, as you will see this morning, that stuff that isn't important to us is important to God. He knows about it. He preordains it. So what that there was a guy named Darius I, Hystaspes, that was going to be a king in Greece, at a such and such a time. That there was going to be an Antigonus and an Antiochus the third and an Antiochus the fourth. So what's the big deal? God is showing, I know ahead of time all the details. I know who's going to come, when they're going to come, how long they're going to be there, and what's going to happen to them. We are being reminded that we have a sovereign God. That's so important because it's so easy for us living in our culture to have our confidence shaken and whittled down, just like Mike bumped into a guy that formerly believed the Bible and no longer believes it. And if you're not careful, the world will weasel it out of you too. You'll become apathetic. And that is worse than hating God. At least hate is an emotion. But apathy is total lack of emotion, total lack, you're dead. the living dead, you know. And if there's anything God hates, it's people who are his people, who've been bought with the precious blood of Christ, who become apathetic, the living dead, who refuse to be involved, knowledgeable, growing, and active for him. And prophecy, one of the great spin-off effects of knowing that prophecy is merely history written beforehand by a God that knows intimate details about people's lives well in advance, it should be remind us that, hey, we deal with a God that is interested in the details of our lives, that he is going to get his way. So let's get into it. The chapter's in 3 parts. Verses 1 and 2, we have a background to the Greek Empire. In verses 3 to 35, we have key developments of the Greek Empire over a 300-year period. The background to the Greek Empire covers a period of 200 years. The Greek Empire itself covered about 300 years. And in verses 36 to the end of the chapter, we have the significance of the Greek Empire. That's the whole point of this chapter. I want to say that again. The background to the Greek Empire is just a quick survey of the Persian Empire in 2 verses. Daniel was alive during the Persian Empire. He was living in the year 553 BC when this stuff was given to him. I think it was 536 BC. He was in the reign of Darius the Mede. Or no, actually it was Cyrus the Persian in chapter 10. Chapter 11 is a continuation of chapter 10. 3 years before it had been Darius the Mede, and 3 years later now the stronger Persian monarch had deposed the Median ally that had helped him beat out the Babylonians. Okay, I got that straight. All right, and so 3 years later, in the year 536, Daniel's given this vision. He's living under the Persian Empire, and he's being reminded by the angel, look at, God knows how many more there's going to be before the Persians are knocked out of kilter by the Greeks, and then very detailed survey of what's going to happen. It starts out general and it gets very specific. God focuses in on one particular Greek monarch who in history is not really a very powerful individual, but at the time that he lived, he was very symbolic because of the nature of his actions. And his exploits are recorded in great detail by this historian, well known in Jewish history because of what he did. And what he did, what this one particular Greek monarch did, between the years 171 and 168 BC, a period of 6+ years, was itself almost exactly parallel to the coming career of the Antichrist. That's the significance of this whole vision. God wanted Daniel to put down for his, not ancestors, the people that would follow him. What's the word I'm looking for? Descendants. Thank you very much. Talking about brain dead. God wanted Daniel to put down for his descendants and for God's people the fact that God was well aware of the big picture that the Greeks would follow the Persians, but he wanted them to realize that the developments within the Greek Empire would filter down to one particular small king who did stuff to the Jews in Jerusalem over almost a 7-year period, almost parallel to the Antichrist career of 7 years. It was 6.4 years for this Antiochus Epiphanes, and 7 years for the Antichrist, if Scripture is literal, which I think it is, right? And his life is meant to be a picture of the Antichrist. Let's look at it. The background to the Greek Empire in verses 1 and 2. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, the angel said, stood to confirm and to strengthen him. This is not a contradiction to the stuff in verse 1 of chapter 10. The first year of Darius the Mede was 539, and in verse 1 of chapter 10, it's the third year of Cyrus, is 536. So chapter 10 looks like it's 3 years before this. You know, it's like it's going backwards, but that's not what it's saying. Chapter 11 is a continuation of chapter 10. The angel who was speaking in the year 536 to Daniel at this point is saying, 3 years ago, I stood and I ministered to that previous king. That's what he's saying. Back then, 3 years ago, I stood to confirm and to strengthen that particular monarch. That was my assignment from God. And now, behold, today, 536, 3 years later, I will show you the truth. There shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Now, we don't have time to go into the details, but the point is that there were more than 4 kings between when Daniel was alive, the Persian rulers. There were more than 4 Persian rulers from this point to the onset of the Greek Empire, but the next 3 were significant because they take us to the end of Old Testament history. It was the last of those first three Persian kings that allowed the temple and the wall. First, the temple was rebuilt, and then the wall. It was the last of those third of those Persian monarchs that allowed the walls to be rebuilt for the city of Jerusalem to have stability. That takes us to the book of Nehemiah and so forth. And it was later on a 4th Persian monarch, which, God could pick the ones he wants, any 4. So he picks a 4th one that would, I don't even know the guy's name, but he picked a fight with the Greeks to the west, back in the 5th century BC. And God said he's going to pick a fight with the Greeks, and they're going to lose. And so that's the background. The Persian kingdom lasted for about 200 years, from 539 to about 330 something, about 200 years. And then in verse 3, he talks about the Greeks. And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity. His own family wasn't going to take over, which was normally the rule, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. And we have a hint, because the remainder of this chapter, which we're not going to read, it talks about verse 5, the king of the south, and verse 6 talks about the king of the north. And those are the 2 primary players. But there was a king to the east and a king to the west. This is obviously talking about, there's no quibble. I mean, Bible scholars, checked out secular history. It fits together hand in glove here. Alexander the Great died in the year 320, 320 or 322 BC. It was him that was the general that expanded the Greek Empire over a period of just a few years, about a dozen years, all the way to the borders of India. It says, a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he's at the top of his power, he dies, and his kingdom doesn't go to his family members. Alexander the Great did have a son, but his son was murdered, and the kingdom was divided between the 4 generals that operated his army. One of the generals took over Greece, and what is today is Bosnia-Herzegovina, Yugoslavia, Thrace it was called in ancient history. One of his generals took over Persia, Syria and Asia Minor, and the Near East. Get this right now. One of them took over Macedonia. That was the Alexander's home country, Greece, Macedonia, northern Greece. One of them took over what is today Yugoslavia and Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. And one of them took over Egypt to the south of Palestine, the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. And one of them took over Syria, which was north of Israel and Palestine. Okay? Now that's really significant, because in the development of the story as the vision is unfolded to Daniel, the guys to the west in Macedonia and the guy to the in Asia Minor, those 2 to the west and the northwest, were not significant in terms of their impact on the nation Israel. Okay? That's why the picture now narrows in the prophecy to the dealings between the king of the north, which was, if I can remember his name was Seleucus. That was the general that took over the north territory, and Ptolemy the First, who was the general that took over Egypt to the south of Israel. And so Israel is smack dab in the middle between Ptolemy's territory, Egypt, and Seleucus was the king of Syria and that area going over towards Babylon. Now, I'm not going to read it, but verses 5 to 20 in great detail, and this, I'll tell you something, the details of this prophecy are 200 years in advance from the fulfillment. 300, some of it 300 years in advance. Some of this stuff didn't happen for 300 years. It wasn't fulfilled for 300 years. But when it was fulfilled, In the days after Christ, in the early church, there was a very intelligent man who studied this, and he advanced the theory that the book of Daniel had been written in the first century after Christ, because it was so exact that it couldn't have been prophecy. It had to have been history, but it was written as if it was prophecy. You understand that? And there are literally thousands of people that believe that that's what Isaiah was. Isaiah was written hundreds of years after. Daniel was written hundreds of years after, because the prophecies were so intricate, so detailed, so exact, so detailed and exact that they couldn't have been prophecy. Very few people believe in prophecy today, except Bible-believing Christians. Okay? So people that don't believe the authority of the Bible, they have to have some other explanation. The only other possible explanation is that it was actually written by a historian and written as if it was a prediction. You see? Which reminds us, Bible believers, that prophecy is absolutely profound. It's just one of those unanswerable arguments. Jesus, 1,000 years before he was put to death, was predicted in a time when crucifixion wasn't even practiced that he was going to be crucified. It tells us how he's going to be crucified, under what circumstances he was going to be crucified, how many days he was going to go in the grave, the fact that he was going to be resurrected from the grave. Some of this stuff over 1,000 years in advance. Fulfilled prophecy is the unanswerable argument in favor of the authority of the Bible as God's Word. Okay? So getting back on track, these verses, from verses 5 to 20, if you were to read this book, Josephus, read what a Jewish secular historian recorded who lived after the fact and is recording what had come down to him as historical facts, compared to what he wrote about the Greek Empire, to what Daniel wrote in these verses, fits hand in glove. Fits hand in glove. I'm going to read you a few verses of what this man, this historian, wrote about Antiochus Epiphanes, and the prophecy and the history go like this. Starting in verse 21. It comes down in verses 21 to 35, the career of a particular king that was descended from this particular guy. Antiochus IV was a Seleucid king, right? He was in this dynasty started by Seleucus, right? Many years later, 200 years later, in the year 171, Antiochus came on the scene. We won't read it, but at verse 21, he's called a vile person. To whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, he shall come up and shall become strong with small piece of people. And as you read through verses 21 to 35, you discover that Antiochus comes in at one particular point, and he defiles the temple of Zerubbabel that was rebuilt in the 5th century BC. He put a pig on the altar. We don't read that here, but in Josephus' account, we read that he hated the Jews with a passion. He came in with flatteries. Let me read it. 2 verses here. Now Antiochus, upon the agreeable situation of the affairs of his kingdom, resolved to make an expedition against Egypt to the south, both because he had a desire to gain it and because he condemned the son of Ptolemy as now weak and not yet of abilities to manage the affairs of such consequence. So he came with great forces to Pelusium, circumvented Ptolemy Philometor with treachery, seized Egypt, but he was driven out. And then verse 3 in this chapter says, Antiochus, returning out of Egypt for fear of the Romans, made an expedition against the city Jerusalem. And when he was there, in the 143rd year of the kingdom of the Seleucidae, he took the kingdom without fighting, those of his own party opening the gates to him through deception. There was a 5th column inside the city. And when he had gotten possession of Jerusalem, slew many of the opposite party, and when he had plundered it of a great deal of money, he went north to Antioch. Then he came back 2 years later. He came up to Jerusalem pretending peace. He got possession of the city by treachery, at which time he spared not so much as those that admitted it into it, on account of the riches that lay in the temple, but led by his covetous inclination, for he saw there was in it a great deal of gold and many ornaments that had been dedicated to it of great value. In order to plunder its wealth, he ventured to break the league he had made. So he broke a covenant. The Antichrist is going to break a covenant. He's going to have a fifth column that brings him into the possession of the holy city. He himself is going to be afraid of the powers of the West, just like this king was afraid of the Romans. He's going to fight against southern political forces, the book of Daniel tells us. It's just the parallels between Antiochus' career and the coming Antichrist are remarkable. He left the temple bare, took away the golden candlesticks, did not abstain from even the veils, which were made of fine linen and scarlet. He emptied the secret treasures. He cast the Jews into great lamentation. He forbade them to offer daily sacrifices. When he had pillaged the whole city, he drove away many captives. And when the king had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice, that led... And actually, it was that event in the year 168 that led the Jewish zealots, mercenaries hiding out in the hills to just say, okay, this is it. We'd rather die than live under this. And they formed an army, and they actually beat out this king in the year 168 at great personal cost. And many of them were killed, but they formed the Jewish independence movement, which lasted until the Romans destroyed them about 70 BC or 60 BC. Okay, so there was a short time of Jewish independence. This is talked about in this chapter. In verse 32 of chapter 11, such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help, but many shall cling to them with flatteries, and some of them of understanding shall fall to test them, to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because as yet for a time appointed. You see, the prophecy just takes it down and says, look at, what Antiochus did to these people and fighting against them and so forth was meant to be a picture of something that was going to happen in the time appointed in the end. And verses 36 takes us to the end of the chapter. This is no longer merely a description of Antiochus' exploits. It parallels them pretty good, right? But we know that this is actually pointing forward to the Antichrist because of this reference in verse 35 to the time of the end, a time appointed. In verse 40 it says, and at the time of the end shall these events continue. Now, we're out of time. I have a tendency to go over time. I don't want to, make anybody upset, so I'm not going to go any further with this morning. But I do want to just leave you with this. This is the main idea here. Our purpose here is not just to come and reflect on history. There's a reason we go to the Scriptures. What's the purpose? The purpose is to realize that the Scriptures are accurate. Prophecy is fulfilled to a letter. The predictions that the prophecies like Daniel has made, starting in verses 36 and going to the end of this chapter, which you ought to go home and read, which is actually a description not only of the career of a very old Greek king that lived for 6 or 7 years back before Christ, but is actually paralleling the future career of the final anti-God world leader that is going to come on the scene someday. God knows about it. He said it would happen. He himself drew parallels from history pointing to that person. And when the time of the end actually comes, the end of what? Daniel chapter 9, 490 years of divine judgment on Israel. Guess what? The last week hasn't happened yet. There are 7 years of 1 week, if you want to call it, of divine judgment still waiting for the nation Israel. And that week is going to describe the career of the Antichrist, who makes a covenant for a week. In the middle of the week, he'll break it. He's going to enter into civil war with the kings of the north, king of the south, tidings out of the east. And that's exactly, almost exactly the kind of the historical steps that Antiochus traced in his career, right? But unlike Antiochus, when Antiochus was destroyed, there was a small Jewish kingdom set up for about 100 years. And yet, chapter 12 says that when the Antichrist is destroyed, Christ comes, sets up his kingdom forever. Right? There's a difference between a few years and forever. And it's just, it's obviously pointing to the Antichrist. This should build your confidence in the truth of the Word of God. This ought to cause you to to look with admiration and respect at the nature of the Holy Scriptures that are given to us. It'll cause you to read them and to reflect on them, make them your daily meat and your food. Make sure you're a believer in Jesus Christ, because you want to be on the true team, the winning team, don't you? You know, we need to make sure that our children get the message and our grandchildren. We need to spread the word to our neighbors and friends. You know, you can't ram it down their throats, but you can live the life and make them want to ask questions. You know, we ought to live consistent, because it was the holy people that set up that kingdom. It was the righteous Jews filled with absolute indignation against this upstart Greek impostor that desecrated the holy temple by putting a forbidden swine on an idol altar. You know, that just made them rip their clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and carry their swords and start, you know, literally killing Greeks at that time. You know, our weapons are spiritual today. All right, we're not, you know, we're not like Muslims in a holy jihad, but we should be fighting for Christ. You know, fighting error and evil. We ourselves should be resisting the immoral tendencies of our day. Okay? Will you join those forces? Will you say again, I belong to the King? Okay? Will you say, this week, let me live for Jesus? Will you do that? That's what this really means. Okay? Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for the privilege of being your people, and we thank you that we're on the winning team. Sometimes we're almost in despair, and we look around us and we see how wicked and vile and evil and almost pandemic evil has become in our society. There's so little regard for the Scriptures, so little regard for Jesus Christ, so little regard for moral rightness and truth, that it's sometimes difficult for us to stand. Help us, Lord, to turn in faith to you. Be like Daniel and the righteous Jews that lived at the time of Antiochus, and help us to stand up and say, okay, at whatever the cost, I will live for you. We ask this in Jesus' name. And in that respect, everybody ought to get one of these. Maybe we could have some. Would you put those out and give them out? The Supreme Court just said that it's okay for men to marry men, women to marry women, and yet that can still be resisted if there's enough outcry from the Canadian populace. You know, there is something that can be done about it. So join